record, and I've hit record. So turn in your Bibles again to 1 Samuel chapter 23. And the lesson that I've got this entitled tonight, or at least this passage from 1 Samuel, is God's providence saves David. And we're going to see how that comes to pass by the time we get to the end of the chapter. Begin. Go ahead and hit that next slide for me, Dad. All right, so for those that maybe are watching later, but again, what you see behind, what you see on the screen, what you see again, this is a map of David's locations. We're going to try to point this out as we go forward, and I think Dad's here. He's going to help me out pointing out some of these locations as we get to them. For those that are here, that map's going to stay up for the remainder of the time for our Bible class tonight, just to give you an idea of again where he's going. He's first going off the first 4 points. He's heading south, and then the last two he's going to head east. And we'll talk specifically more about that as we get there. But that's again a general idea of where David is traveling in chapter 23. All right, so let's go ahead and move to the text for this. And so again, we're picking up verse 14, and right as we left off last time, David had escaped Saul's pursuit of him in the city of Keilah. So verse 14, David abode in the wilderness in strongholds and remained in a mountain in the wilderness of Ziph. Which I believe Dad's pointing that out right now. The third dot below, the third dot moving south is the wilderness of Ziph. And next week, hopefully, I'll have some pictures of some of these areas so that we can look at it. So that's where David is. Saul sought him every day, but God delivered him not into his hand. What verse 14 is it's a basic summation of events. And what's going to happen in verse 15 and following is that we're going to see a specific episode within this time frame where David is hiding out in the wilderness of Ziph and Saul is continuing to pursue him. I'll note, as you can see on your screen, if you're here presently with us, the city of Ziph, or the wilderness of Ziph, it was about 12 miles southeast of Keilah. The terrain is a little bit different. I know you think about wilderness, as we talked about Hereth. I believe you remember we noted that when you looked at it from the top down, you saw that green, all the trees and stuff that were in Hereth. The wilderness of Ziph is actually more arid. And we may not get that just by looking at the word wilderness, but Ziph, you think closer to a desert than what Hereth looked at. And we'll look at some pictures next week of what that place looks like. But you note again, verse 14, it's a constant pursuit of David, right? Saul sought him every day, but God delivered him not into his hand. Now, what's important in verse 14 is that phrase again, God delivered him not into his hand. And that's important because earlier in the chapter, Saul had said when David was in Keilah that God had delivered him into his hand. But the writer here notes very clearly, verse 14, even though Saul had said at one moment that God had delivered David into his hand, the writer notes that God delivered him not into his hand. That's a clear refutation of what Saul had said at Keilah. And so it's important to connect 23:14 with the verse that came earlier, where it talked about Saul and saying that God had delivered David into his hand at the city of Keilah. All right, so getting into the specific episode now, verse 15. All right, David saw that Saul was come out to seek his life, and David was in the wilderness of Ziph in a wood. The word there for wood is the word horish, Horesh. Some translations may have that. It's an arid place. We'll look at it again next week. But apparently, this is a place where you had some water because it's called the woods, or it's called a forest. And you think naturally, what a forest does is that it provides protection, not just from natural resources, but also when it comes to line of sight. I'll give you an example of this. Monday night, me and some of the others here went over to Maywood Christian Camp, and this time of the year, the leaves haven't grown on the trees. And one of the things about that is that over towards the older boy's cabin, there's a pathway that you cannot see oftentimes during the summer because the trees that have foliage on it blocks your view of seeing that path. But in the wintertime, when the leaves are not there, you can get a clear picture of that. So likewise, one of the things that David hiding out in the woods would do is that it would be hard to spot David and his men from a distance. So perhaps that's why he is specifically here. But as we move on to verse 16, we note that Jonathan comes to meet David. And this will be the last time that's recorded in the Old Testament that Jonathan and David meet. Verse 16, Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David into the wood and strengthened his hand in God. Now, over the course of all this is going on, more than likely Jonathan and David have somehow developed a system to communicate with one another. Probably they have secret messengers talking to one another. That's probably how David knows about Saul's intent and actions. Likewise, it would help explain why Jonathan knew where to go and to meet David. And it would also, again, keep Saul from knowing where Jonathan was if there's a secret way of communicating here that Saul didn't know about that Jonathan did, and hence they're able to meet. And again, what you see here, as you have seen on other occasions, is that Jonathan demonstrates what it means to be a good friend to David. Verse 17, he said unto him, Fear not, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find thee, and thou shalt be king over Israel, and I shall be next unto thee, and that also my father Saul knoweth. And you note verse 17, or the end of verse 16, that phrase that Jonathan strengthened David's hand in God. Generally, when that phrase is used in the Old Testament, it's used as a way to encourage people who are afraid. In Job chapter 4, verse 3, Eliphaz uses that expression to describe how Job had helped out those that were neglected, those that were without, how he had encouraged them in Job 4, verse 3. In Nehemiah 6, verse 9, you see the phrase used again. And in that context, you have the enemies of Nehemiah that are trying to keep the Israelites from building the wall. And Nehemiah says there that I believe that God strengthened their hand or gave them the encouragement to keep working, to keep building the wall despite the threats that Nehemiah's enemies were making. So the phrase, just in a general sense, it means to give encouragement to those that are afraid. And if you put yourself in David's shoes again, you've got a lot of reasons why you would be afraid. Right? He's on the run. As we talked about, he's essentially a stranger. He's sort of a foreigner within his own territory because he's on the run. You think about what has just happened with the city of Keilah. The people that he had just saved, you would think would have been appreciative of what he had done, and yet they were the ones that were willing to turn on him, to turn him into Saul. So David probably has trust issues going on here, right? Who can I trust? The people that I help, if they are willing to turn me in, how much faith can I put in people at this point? And that's a pretty good segue, a thing to think about, a thought to think about, why we have to put our trust in God, because over and over you'll see throughout the section that God's not going to desert David, even when some of the people David helped were willing to turn their back on him. And David got through this because he put his trust on God and on godly men like Jonathan. And Jonathan's come basically to encourage David, who is obviously afraid. Verse 17, he said unto him, Fear not, for the hand of Saul shall not find thee, and thou shalt be king over Israel. I shall be next unto thee, and that also Saul my father knoweth. Now, what I've noted here is that in verse 17, Jonathan gives David 4 reassurances that were to comfort him. The first one, the hand of Saul my father shall not find thee. And specifically keeping in mind, Jonathan's saying, no matter what Saul has done, no matter how much Saul tries to pursue after thee, David, you don't have to worry anything about it because Saul's never going to catch you. That's the first reassurance. The second one, thou shalt be king over Israel. Right? That was a promise that had been guaranteed by God because, again, Samuel had anointed him. Jonathan at this point is aware of that. And Jonathan, a man who is of great faith, as we saw in chapter 14, Jonathan is just as much assured of that fact that David will become the next king. But more importantly, the third reassurance, I shall be next unto thee. In other words, Jonathan's saying, not only are you going to be king, but as the son of the current king, I'm not going to be a rival to you. I'm not going to challenge you. I'm not going to try to, undermine your authority. Instead, I'm going to be right next to you, or your second-hand man. And it shows, again, Jonathan's loyalty to David. It shows that Jonathan is optimistic about this future in which he is not king. And so David, if Jonathan has that optimism, David should as well. And then finally, all right, not only shall I be next unto thee, but that also Saul my father knoweth. That Saul knows that David is the next anointed king. Saul knows that's what Jonathan's saying. Not only that, but Saul also knows that Jonathan's loyalty at the end of the day lies with David, as he's seen on multiple occasions. And adding on further to that, all those instances where Saul has talked about God being on his side to deliver David, if Saul knows what has transpired between David, God, and him being anointed, then Saul knows deep down that all of those words about God being on his side, at the end of the day, that's baloney. Is sort of what Jonathan's saying here. Saul knows very well that God has over and over again been showing his favor toward David rather than to himself. And so, perhaps it shows that Saul's lacking in confidence, if that's the case. So, David, you have a lot of reasons why you need to be optimistic about where you're at. So that by verse 18, we see that they renew the covenant once again. And they too made a covenant before the Lord. And David abode in the wood, and Jonathan went to his house. So we talked about the covenant before, but again, it's just another way of showing that Jonathan and David are on the same page, and that David has a reason to trust Jonathan. All right, so let's move on to verse 19. I'll take some comments after we get down through verse 24, because I want to make sure that we get through this entire chapter tonight. All right, so beginning of verse 19, we read about a new group of people called the Ziphites. And again, if you look back there on the map, you go down to that third dot, that's where the wilderness of Ziph is. And the inhabitants there, they're known as the Ziphites. Now, verse 19, let's go ahead and read that verse. Then came the Ziphites to Saul to Gibeah, saying, Doth not David hide himself with us in strongholds in the wood, in the hill of Hachilah, which is on the south of Jeshimon? So there are a couple of things to keep in mind here. One, the Ziphites are actually a part of the tribe of Judah. And you can go back to Joshua 15 and read how they are connected to the tribe of Judah. But as we've seen before, generally loyalty to the tribe mattered, right? That was Saul when he criticized the Benjamites for not delivering David into his hands. He pointed that out, right? If you're of the tribe of Benjamin, you should be loyal to me because I'm a Benjamite. Well, in the same way the Benjamites didn't help Saul out, David's own brethren, at least the Ziphites in Judah, they don't help him out. And this is obviously a great contrast. Jonathan, who was the son of Saul, who would naturally be an enemy of David, helped David. Whereas the Ziphites, who are of the tribe of Judah, would naturally be an ally of David. They turn their back on David here. But another thing that you note here is that they actually initiate the communication, right? Then came the Ziphites to Saul of Gibeah. In the other instances where we saw Saul dealing with people that had helped David, it had been Saul that had to go to them to initiate and to begin the discussion. But this is actually an instance where we see the Ziphites take the initiative to go to Saul and tell him that David is hiding out in their country. So it really, in a way, it makes the Ziphites not look good at all. Not just that they collaborated with Saul, but they were the ones that instigated that. And so they're not portrayed in a positive light. You might want to put in your Bible, beginning in verse 19, Psalm 54. Because what you see in Psalm 54 is a psalm that David wrote in response to the events that are going to happen over the next few verses. Psalm 54. In fact, I want you to, if you've got your Bibles with you, I hope you do, I want you to look at Psalm 54 and verse 3. Note how David describes the Ziphites in that verse. If you know the superscription at the top of chapter 54, you know that the Ziphites or the Ziphims there, this is who David's talking about. But Psalm 54 verse 3, know what David calls the Ziphites here. Strangers are risen up against me, and oppressors seek after my soul. They have not set God before them. To refer to one's tribe as strangers was a very harsh remark about that individual. That's what David's saying here about these Ziphites. Because of what they do here, it's almost like they're no longer my people. They're traitors to me because they sided with Saul. We're going to come back to chapter 54 of Psalm 54 in a moment. But keep that in mind, how David thinks about them. Now you might ask yourself again, why would they betray David? Well, keep in mind that David and his men had recently settled in that territory. And at this point, David has a lot of men. As we saw last week, about 600 men. It could have been that they just got tired of dealing with them. It could have been that they, like the men of Keilah, that they were afraid of Saul, of what Saul would do to them if he found out that they were hiding David. And they would not have want their city to be destroyed. So maybe those are some reasons why they turned their back on David. We don't know, obviously, but it turns out to not go very well for them in the end. Again, this is a place with a lot of hills. That becomes a common theme tonight. So, verse 20, now therefore, O king, come down according to all the desire of thy soul to come down, and our part shall be to deliver him into the king's hand. So basically, the Ziphites, they give Saul the invitation, come down whenever you want. Again, the phrase, according to all the desire of thy soul, come down at your convenience, is what the Ziphites are telling Saul here. And so the Ziphites are playing an active role again, right? We will turn David over to you. We're not going to bring David to you, but if you come down here, we're not going to stop you from taking David and doing with him what you will. And I've got in my Bible here, it's not all that different from what happened with Judas and Jesus, right? It's not like Judas went in and grabbed Jesus and drug him to the authorities, but as we know, Judas betrayed Jesus because he brought the authorities to capture him. And so there's some similarities there between how Judas handled Jesus and what the Ziphites are doing here with David. But at the end of the day, they have no problem turning on their no problem turning on their fellow man of Judah. So, verse 21, we read about Saul's response to the Ziphites. Saul said, "Blessed be ye of the Lord, for ye have compassion on me." Now again, note what Saul says about this event, right? Blessed be ye of the Lord. Another way we might say that is, you are doing the Lord's work by turning David over to me. Obviously, we know that they are in the wrong, right? Because Saul is not a man with David, but it does bring out a thought for us to consider. Just because somebody says, I am of the Lord, that I do something of the Lord, doesn't always mean I'm in the right relationship with God. And you can think about this in a number of ways, but I'm sure you've probably heard, somebody say that, I've heard this said, at least people that are closer to my age, but the idea that, if you don't preach on sin, you don't worry about, if you don't preach on sin, if you accept everybody, no matter what sins that are in their life, even though they don't want to repent of them, that shows that you have the love of God. Or another way of saying that, some people will say that if you don't tolerate homosexuality, for instance, if you think that homosexuality is a sin, you don't have the love of God. So sometimes whenever you've seen churches that have moved to supporting homosexuality and basically to teach that it's not a sin, you'll see some Christians say, well, this is the love of God in action. Well, in reality, though, that's not the case at all. Even though those individuals would say that, those churches are doing the work of the Lord because they're no longer preaching that homosexuality is a sin, and you can plug whatever sin in you want there. If that's the point they're trying to make, then even though they're saying that those churches are doing the work of the Lord, it's not all that different from what Saul is saying here. He said that the Ziphites are doing the work of the Lord. Problem is that what they were doing was betraying God's anointed next king. And so maybe you see some overlap there. What's happening here, the compliment that Saul's giving the Ziphites doesn't matter much at all. And sometimes people in the religious world, they try to seek the compliments of men. And if that means betraying some of the principles of the Bible to do so, they don't have any problem doing that as long as they get the praise or the compliments of men. And that's what the Ziphites, at the end of the day, are doing. They'd rather have the compliments of Saul rather than being in the right standing with God. I know Paul, 2 Corinthians chapter 10, talked about the need to the need to have the praise of God over the praise of men. And that's 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 16 through 17. But again, something to think about here. They've got the praise of Saul, but not the praise of God. Note at the end of verse 21, Saul says that the Ziphites had compassion on him. That is a direct statement and a direct indictment on all these other individuals we've studied before that did not help Saul capture David. The Benjamites, the priest of Nob, the prophets, his own son Jonathan, that is a statement that Saul is making against them. They did not have compassion on him like the Ziphites did, because the Ziphites are helping him find David. One thing to keep in mind about that phrase is generally a king would not speak to his subjects in that way. Because generally the king was the one who did the granting of compassion. It worked from the king extending compassion generally, rather than the people having to show compassion to the king. To give you an idea of that, you remember in Jonah chapter 4, once the city of Nineveh had repented, what happened? Jonah became angry. What happens before? He became angry that they repented, and then what happens after that? God caused something to grow from the ground. Yeah, a gourd, right? And it overshadowed Jonah, and then by the time that the gourd, I believe by the next day, the gourd had withered up and dried, and Jonah got mad about that because it was hot where he was at, and that tree that comforted him had been taken away. But you remember what God had said in response to that?
You had compassion on the gourd, but not on these people that are spared.
Yeah, so God told Jonah, verse 9, dost thou well to be angry for the gourd? And he said, I do well to be angry even unto death. Jonah is so angry, he's angered unto death, is what he says there, verse 9. But verses 10 and 11, then said the Lord, thou hast pity on the ground for which thou hast not labored, neither madest it grow, which came up in a night and perished in a night. And should not I spare Nineveh, that great city, wherein are more than 6,000 persons, that cannot discern between their right hand and their left hand, and also much cattle? And the point that God's making there is that God has the right to show compassion to who he wants to show compassion. If the Ninevites repent, even though they were the enemies of God, Jonah didn't have any right to criticize God for being merciful or for being compassionate to them, because God is, again, the sole creator. He is the ruler. He is the authority over all the earth. It is within God's right to be able to do that. Likewise, Romans 9 verse 15 which is a reference from when Moses talked with God in Exodus 33. God extends that same thing. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. So the point being is that God has the authority to extend compassion to whoever he wants. But when Saul says that they had compassion on him, that's putting himself in a position underneath the people. And what it shows to us is that Saul is at the mercy of the Ziphites, because in order to preserve himself, he has to kill David. He doesn't have God's help with that, and he has to rely on the Ziphites to do that. Generally, a king would not have to use the wording like that. And perhaps that, thinking about it in light of how God extends compassion to several individuals in the Old and New Testament, hopefully that sort of gets the point across. But Saul is gracious to them. Verse 22, Go, I pray you, prepare yet, and know and see his place where his haunt is, and who hath seen him there? For it is told me that he dealeth very subtly. The word haunt there, if you've got another translation, what do you have there? Hideout. Literally the word means foot, and the indication is it's where your foot walks, or where your path is. And so it indicates a dwelling place or a living space, and that's where you get the word hideout there. So what Saul asked for the Ziphites to do, go ahead and move to verse 23 for me. So David is very subtle. He's very clever in what he's doing. Verse 23, See therefore and take knowledge of all the lurking places where he hideth himself, and come ye again to meet with me with the certainty, and I will go with you, and it shall come to pass, if he be in the land, that I will search him out throughout all the thousands of Judah. So all Saul wants the Ziphites to do, verse 23, is he wants them to scout out David. His routine, his patterns, he does when he wakes up, whatever his routine is about his day, where he goes, Saul wants an in-depth report of that. He wants a scouting report of David and his men, so that Saul doesn't have a situation like Keilah where David is able to escape and the search was fruitless. Saul wants to be able to capture David, and a good scouting report will help him out. So verse 24, they return to Ziph. They arose and went to Ziph before Saul, but David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the plain on the south of Jeshimon. With that being said, are there any comments on what we've discussed so far?
It's amazing. Back up, it says that Saul sought David every day, and he's the king. I mean, he's running a kingdom, maybe millions of people, and a lot of responsibilities, but he just so focused and eaten up with killing David, he just ignores the needs of the kingdom just to seek the life of David.
Yeah, and that I think that shows sort of the hallmarks of somebody who is paranoid. And the point was made, Saul was basically abandoning the kingdom to pursue after David. Again, Saul being so fixated on David, it sort of required him to make those decisions, which at the end of the day probably were not wise decisions. Let's look at verses 24 through 29 before we go. We got about 10 minutes left. Verse 24, David's in the wilderness of Maon. You can leave it there, Dad. You can leave it there. Again, Maon, if you look on your screen, it's the fourth dot down. It's farther south. It's it's only a few miles south of Ziph, as you can tell there. The city will come into importance in chapter 25 because that's going to be the hometown of Nabal. But verse 25, Saul hears wind of this, and he pursues after David thanks to the Ziphites. So the indication in verse 25 is that Saul is coming down to attack David at Ziph, and David moves to Maon. So that by verse 26, Saul catches up with David. Saul went on this side of the mountain, verse 25, the end of verse 25, if you can go back for me. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Maon. All right, so Saul went to Ziph, David had gone to Maon. Saul has now arrived at Maon. Now, verse 26, we're talking about the wilderness of Maon, so outside of it. And if you see on the map there, that location, we'll talk about its name in a minute. There's not an exact location for where this event takes place, but it's somewhere east of Maon. And it gets closer to where we end tonight in verse 29. All right, verse 26, Saul went on this side of the mountain, and David and his men on that side of the mountain. And so, I'm just going to explain it like this. You've got a picture here of a single mountain. And we could say, on the west side of the mountain, you've got Saul and his forces. On the eastern slope of the mountain, you've got David and his forces. And Saul knows where David's at. So, verse 26, Saul's on the west side, David's on the east side. David made haste to get away for fear of Saul, for Saul and his men compassed David and his men round about to take them. So what Saul decides to do is, in order to stop David from escaping, he tells his armies to circle around on the eastern side of the mountain. And so that way David has no way to get down from the mountain without having to go through Saul's forces. So, verse 26, if you stop there, the indication is that David is completely surrounded by his enemies, and it seems like it is a hopeless situation that David is in. There's no hope that he's going to escape because Saul has got him surrounded. And this is where the title of our thought tonight comes from. Here comes the providence of God to help David. And you can tie this in with Psalm 54 as well, how David gives praise to God for how this situation was handled. All right, verse 27 now. But there came a messenger unto Saul, saying, Haste thee and come, for the Philistines have invaded the land. The providence of God at work here is that a messenger arrives with news that the Philistines are attacking the land. The word therefore, invade, it's stronger than just attack. There's two literal meanings of that word. It means to spread out and strip. So, spread out, you think about widespread. They're not attacking one city, but you've got the idea of they're trying to overrun, they're trying to take a lot of land. What you also have there in the word invade is that they want to strip the place of its resources. So complete destruction is what they're after. So, we note verse 28, Saul returned from pursuing after David. Now you might think to yourself, why does Saul do this? He's been so focused on trying to capture David. He's had David slip out of his hands, and now Saul has the perfect opportunity to take David, and yet we see that Saul leaves David to pursue after the Philistines. Why did he do this? Well, in a general sense, the Philistines would have been a much greater problem, right? David's just one man. He's not trying to, start another kingdom or anything like that. He's just an enemy to Saul. But with the Philistines here, they're trying to take the land, right? It's one thing to worry about David, but Saul cannot be a king if he doesn't have a kingdom. If Saul and his armies are not there to defend the borders of Israel, Saul may capture David, but he comes back to Gibeah and he doesn't have a kingdom to rule over anymore because he's lost all of that land. Think about the loyalty of the people as well, right? If Saul is not there as the captain of God's people to protect them, why should the Israelites, who are going to lose a lot of land to the Philistines, why should they ever trust Saul again? If he's not there to come to their aid, why should they ever trust him again if he doesn't come to the rescue of his people? Likewise, if Saul doesn't do that, why have we not been trusting David all along, who over and over again has proved himself to be the greatest defender at this point in time of Israel from the nation of Philistia? So think about that. Saul would have that weighing on his mind, and thus Saul has to leave David to protect his people. If he wants to be a king, he's still got to have a kingdom. And so that the Israelites, David and his men, they called that place. If you got your King James version here, it's Selah Amalekath, or the translation that most probably have is either Rock of Escape, which I believe Dad is pointing to there. I believe it's the fifth dot there on the screen. The Rock of Escape, or the Crag of Divisions. And obviously, you think about Rock of Escape, you know how it gets the name. Some translations have Crag of Divisions, because what happens here is God divides, through his providence, he divides Saul from David. He gets Saul to leave and to go back to Philistia. And we'll look at some more images of that next week, if time permits. So David's able to escape. Verse 29, David went up from thence and dwelt in strongholds at En-gedi. That's pointed out on your screen. En-gedi, you can actually go to that place today. There's still some remains there, but En-gedi is located on the western portion of the Dead Sea. And hopefully next week we will be able to look at some of the pictures of the places that we talked about this week. Didn't really have time to get those put into the PowerPoint. With that being said, are there any thoughts or comments on what you want to add on to what we've talked about tonight?
David was God's man, and yet that did not prevent him from having all this trouble that God protected him, God helped him. But still, just because you're God's person doesn't mean you're going to escape.
Right.
God's trouble. Right.
And one final thought, another point of application, a little positive point to tie in with this. Just because the situation seems hopeless doesn't mean that there's not, an opportunity to get out of that situation. Again, David was surrounded on that mountain. Everything seemed hopeless, but out of the unlikeliest of people, the Philistines helped save David, and in that way. And the point being is that sometimes the providence of God works in a lot of ways where we don't understand. Who would have thought that the Philistines attacking Israel would actually preserve Israel? Well, no one at that point would have, but in this particular situation, the Philistines' attack is going to actually preserve the nation of Israel. And so God's providence worked in a lot of ways that at the time would not have seemed to have made sense. But David, if you go read Psalm 54, you recognize that David understood that God's providence was at work there. Well, that being said, we'll stop here for tonight. But again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. We'll pick up in chapter 24, Lord willing, next Wednesday.